Taoiseach, 900 residents of Dublin's Longboat Quay have been instructed to cough up millions of euros for repairs to their homes because they were built without adequate fire safety measures. And they've been told that unless they do so by the 1st of November, they face eviction. Taoiseach, are you also aware that families who were allocated a block of 62 apartments in Prospect Hill on Dublin's Finglas Road have been told by Dublin City Council that there are health and safety issues with these apartments? This apartment block is one of several on a larger site of over 500 occupied apartments which may have the same problem. Are you also aware of the Riverwalk Court complex in Ratoath, which is County Meath's version of Longboat Quay? Clearly, Taoiseach, these are not isolated cases. Properties bought at considerable expenses have been verified in report after report as substandard and dangerous. How do you intend to reassure residents that unscrupulous property developers and not unfortunate residents will be held responsible for unsafe building work? Given that NAMA, local councils and the government itself have been aware for years of these health and safety issues, can you spell out the steps you have taken to deal with this scandalous situation? And can you indicate, this is the key primary question I have for you, Taoiseach, can you indicate how many residential developments have been built without adequate safety measures?
Thank you.
No, I can't. I can't give you that answer. But what I am convinced of, Deputy Adams, is that there are other longboat quay situations out there and other Priory Hall situations out there. And all of that has brought absolute wreckage to the careers and the ambitions and the lives of so many people in our country. And it all happened because of a rush to greed, a rush to build indiscriminately, without following the conditions and the regulations that were laid down as the proper building standards. I don't know, Deputy Adams, how many other cases around the country were built to an inferior standard. I do not know if there are other apartment blocks out there where traps exist or where fire hazards exist. Unfortunately, they're now coming to light long after those who provided them have absconded or are not in the business. Your Deputy Leader wanted to make a phone call to a developer yesterday as if this could sort it all out. I made the point to you, Deputy MacDonald, that the Longboat Quay apartments are a combination of a number of entities, and Minister Kelly met with personnel about this yesterday. This is an example of the worst kind of situation in our country, where people who went off legitimately and got their money to buy their homes or apartments or houses and find afterwards that for reasons beyond their control, these are not what they thought they were. At the end of the day, somebody probably expects the taxpayer to fork out for all of these things. The situation is that responsibility is vested and was vested in the regulations and the conditions that were granted when planning permission was granted in the first place. So I don't know the answer to your question, Deputy Adams, but I'll take the places that you've mentioned and ask Minister Kelly and the authorities to carry out investigations on those places. But I'm convinced that there are probably others in other locations around the country where, unfortunately, the same situation actually applies.
Deputy Adams.
Well, I'm very concerned about your answer, Taoiseach, because you say that you are aware that there are many other Longboat Quay, Prospect Hill, River Walk Court developments. You say you're aware of this, but you can't tell how many. So how long, Taoiseach, have you been aware of this? How long have you known that citizens are living in unsafe accommodation? Now, clearly this is the unacceptable face of the Celtic Tiger, as you have said, and of Fianna Fáil light touch regulation. But it's not enough for a Taoiseach to engage only in the blame game. We don't need to be told, and the people who live in these developments don't need to be told what the problem is. You need to tell us the solution. Now, you may recall that the Mahan report had a key recommendation, and that was the appointment of an independent planning regulator. You haven't acted on this. will you support the Sinn Féin bill which is published today by Dr. Brian Stanley to establish an independent planning regulator? Will you also tell us why you haven't introduced legislation to ensure that surveyors, architects, builders and planners are accountable? And on what basis, Taoiseach, moral or otherwise, do you expect residents to pick up the tab for what you describe as the unscrupulous behaviour of those developers and others who built these unsafe developments? Do you agree with Minister Kelly that property tax proceeds should be used? And finally, Ceann Comhairle, can you confirm if there are criminal investigations into these matters? And will your government introduce the necessary legislation before you go to ensure developers and not residents are left to foot the bill?
Taoiseach.
Yeah. Well, as the late Dr. Paisley used to say, don't you put words in my mouth.
Exactly.
I didn't say I was aware of the number of locations around the country where inferior building. I said I'm convinced that there are others out there. You've made available here some information about places that you have been informed are of an inferior nature, and I'm going to pass those on to the Minister and the authorities to see that they're investigated, and rightly so. I am convinced, Deputy Adams, that in the so-called Celtic Tiger years that applied under the party opposite, yes, that the situation was that that many buildings and apartment blocks were built very quickly. God knows, Deputy Adams, how many others are out there that are not up to standard.
Sorry. Hold on.
You know you don't let on, I can tell you.
Taoiseach to reply, please. Thank you. This is Leader's question.
Of course, I did see the Spotlight programme, but you know nothing about that either, about buildings in Northern Ireland. No, it's not my answer, Deputy. Not my answer.
Sorry, would you please?
As you're aware, the Planning No. 2 bill will deal with elements of the regulatory authority that's been set up here. Minister Kelly's made changes, and some serious changes in the regulations insofar as the building standards are concerned. And you know as well as I do that while there were meetings to be held, or supposed to be held, on site on a regular basis on all of these developments, they never happened in many cases, and you were left to a situation of considerable chance as to whether shortcuts were taken or not. And the result is, down in the centre of the city, in long quay apartments, inferior quality, substandard, and confusion about all of that, plus the fact that people have now had to, and have been living in these apartments in cases where they were not safe, obviously from fire certificate point of view and all the rest of it. So the Minister has made quite a number of changes in terms of the regulations that apply here, Deputy, and the Planning No. 2 bill, which Minister Coffey and Minister Kelly bring through the Dáil, I think will deal with the regulatory situation here.
Thank you.
But to be honest with you, I think you're going to have to wait for some time until other places are sold or transferred and inspections carried out and say this is not what it's supposed to be. It's an inferior quality. It's substandard. It's not what was planned and given permission for. But the Minister will move to see that that these kind of situations don't apply in the future. And you can't do that unless you have supervision and, mandatory requirement to comply with conditions of planning that are set out in the first place, adhering to the regulations that are in the Planning No. 2 bill and so on.
Deputy Wallace.